Hi, my name is Peter Lyson, and I am with the Door County Museum and Archives. Today I'll be giving you a presentation that I gave in June of 2025. Gosh, dates are hard. Um, but yeah, this is a condensed version of it. So, this talk will be on Peter Custis. Um, Here's a picture of him because he is just kind of a normal guy, and there weren't that many pictures of him because pictures weren't taken of that many people at the time. So here's a picture of him. This one is from the Green Bay Press Gazette. But keep this in mind as we go through the first few slides, as there aren't any other pictures of him. Peter was born into slavery on March 15th, 1842, on the James Custis plantation in Williamsburg, Virginia. His parents were Jim and Hannah Custis, um, and they were all owned by James Custis, who was a relative of Daniel Parke Custis, who was Martha Washington's first husband. Peter lived for about 18 to 19 years in slavery, um, and through that time, he claimed himself that, you know, he wasn't treated as poorly as many other accounts had, on other plantations had described, but he still faced a lot of hardship in slavery. Um, Probably the most notable hardship was that his mother, Hannah, was put up to auction 3 times when Peter was young, and at the last auction, Hannah was sold, making that the final time that Peter ever saw his mother. Um, Peter was also forced to work from a young age. Originally, he was a herder until he was, considered strong enough and old enough to do heavier labor. During this time, Peter would attend church services in the nearby woods run by enslaved pastors who had actually secretly learned how to read. These services were highly secretive, as both literacy and any gathering of slaves were seen as a threat by slave owners who thought they would lead to slave revolt. If it became known that a slave was able to read on the Custis plantation, Peter said that they would be punished by receiving anywhere from 9 to 39 lashes. Still, in remembering religion in slavery, Peter said, and I think with a level of satisfaction, that, quote, the moral conditions among slaves were much higher than the white people in the South at the time. That being said, slavery was just an early chapter of Peter's life, because in 1861, war began, the Civil War, and Peter and the others at the plantation were aware of what was going on, and they were probably made even more aware when James Custis fled his plantation for Charlottesville with his roughly 200 slaves. And actually, he was probably avoiding this battle down here because there was actually a battle, and eventually it was a hospital that was set up at the plantation during the Civil War. But yeah, during the Civil War, James actually gave Peter and a lot of his other slaves to the Confederate Army, where they were building breastworks near Petersburg, Virginia, for the army of General Lee. However, at the Battle of Petersburg, the Wisconsin 36th captured Peter and roughly 400 of what they called at the time contrabands. Um, After his capture, Peter was assigned as a valet to Colonel Warner of the 36th Wisconsin Infantry, it kind of being tradition at the time that Union officers would have one freed slave as their personal valet. It was also during this time that Peter said he was the stable boy for Abraham Lincoln. Well, this hasn't really been confirmed or recorded anywhere that I can find. Colonel Warner was laid up in hospital after getting his arm blown off during the war. Um, and during that time, Peter was then just a stable boy while Colonel Warner was recovering, making it entirely possible that he could have tended Abraham Lincoln's horse at some point there. That being said, once the war was over, Peter returned with Colonel Warner to Dane County, Wisconsin. There he worked as a farmhand, just kind of rotating around the area. He also briefly lived with Dr. Elijah Woodward, a former military surgeon, and while he was living with Dr. Woodward, he attended school for about a year. At school, he learned to read, which was something that he was only able to do because of the Union's victory. In 1868, Peter moved to Green Bay and lived with the Smith family in Preble. The why Peter moved there is really unknown, but we do know that he then worked for the J.W. Woodruff Company in Green Bay, which was a lumber mill, and then he moved to the Smith Brothers, which was like a gardening company, and then he eventually ended up on the steamship MC Howley, which was the steamship on the right here, and he was kind of a deckhand on there. The ship went back and forth from Green Bay to Sturgeon Bay, and this is actually probably how he became aware of the good-paying employment opportunities in Sturgeon Bay. In Green Bay, Peter was making roughly $11 a month, and this is important because we'll get into that on this slide, but we'll get to that later. Peter met Leonia Bell Perry during the time in Green Bay, and he married her in 1884. Uh, Peter and Leonia had two sons, Louis and George. They also had a number of other children that were unfortunately miscarried. That being said, in like 1885 to 1887, the exact date isn't recorded, Peter moved to Sawyer, which is now like the west side of Sturgeon Bay. There he began working at the Hagen and English Quarry, which later became the Green Quarry, as a fireman for the steam engine. At the quarry, Peter's average daily wage was about $1 to $1.75, which is far more than the $11 per month he had previously been making in Green Bay. Again, he almost tripled his wage by moving to Sturgeon Bay. And this highlights kind of the reason why Peter, along with so many others, chose to move to Sturgeon Bay at that time, which was frankly just money. There was a lot of money to move to Sturgeon Bay, and yeah, it afforded Peter a much better life for him and his family. That being said, there were also a lot of hardships for Peter in Sturgeon Bay. In 1889, Leonia Custis died a week after a taxing breech birth to a stillborn child. Shortly after that, Peter, who couldn't really take care of his kids, kind of gave them up. He was part of the Friends Quaker Church, but the Quaker Church offered to step in and essentially take care of his children in the meantime because Peter was working from basically sunrise to sundown every day of the week. Um, that being said, in 1895, George and Louis would actually return to live with Peter, with Louis working at the quarry and George attending school. In 1900, and this is like in a crazy, fascinating defiance of social norms at the time, Peter married Julia Van Duzer, who was the daughter of Police Chief Horace Van Duzer. Again, she was a white woman, and this marks one of the likely very few accepted interracial marriages in Wisconsin at the time. The Door County Democrat did mention, or did call him a slur. They said he was, quote, and this is antiquated terms, a darky in their wedding announcement. Um, but other than that one time, there is no other documented public criticism, both of that marriage and across Peter's life. In 1901, Peter and Julia would have their first daughter, Hannah Custis. She would actually be the only child that would survive survive throughout Peter's entire life. 1903 then marked one of the hardest years, I think, in Peter's entire life because he lost 3 of his children in just 6 months. First, there was a miscarriage with the young Arthur Custis. Their 1-year-old daughter, Melissa Irene, died shortly after. And then George Custis died of alcohol poisoning, which George was one of the 2 sons left from Peter's first marriage. In 1906, Julia Custis then died after fighting a prolonged illness, leaving Peter again alone with the kids. In 1909, Peter began to kind of step away from the quarrying business, and he became a part-time night watchman at the local mill. And around 1912, Peter retired from quarrying entirely, becoming the local city street sweeper. It was during this time that Peter actually became extremely well recorded by the press, with regular mentions of him in the newspaper. They actually began to call him a sign of spring for cleaning the local catch basins in preparation for the spring melt. One account actually was extremely disappointed that he had predicted it wrong and that because it froze over shortly after he had cleaned it. Um, but yeah, in 1920, there would be a few more challenges in Peter's life. Hannah actually ran away with a man from the White Way shows, which is a Chautauqua, which is like at that time it was an adult entertainment slash education movement that was held at the fairgrounds. And she returned about a month later, pregnant with her son Norman. In 1921, Lewis, and remember this is 1921 is during the Prohibition. Lewis drank moonshine, and it was bad moonshine, so he suffered some sort of mental decline, and he was sent to an Oshkosh asylum where he would eventually pass away. In the late 1920s, though, Hannah ended up all right, and she married actually a man named William Bush and moved with him over to Utica, New York, where actually we believe their family still exists today. That all being said, Peter did witness the KKK actually coming to Sturgeon Bay. So, for context, in Wisconsin, the KKK had a brief but notable presence in the 1920s with rallies held in Sawyer, which is the neighborhood where Peter Custis lived. While the Klan in Wisconsin was still under the umbrella of the militant anti-black Klan of the South, they had kind of positioned themselves locally in alliance with like the temperance movement, often trying to place blame on Catholics and immigrants, and especially Catholic immigrants, for what they saw as what they called the moral degradation in the state in Milwaukee and Madison, often associating immigrants with bootlegging. They also kind of were riding on the back of the strong anti-Chinese movement, which was going on at the same time. With that all in mind, in August of 1924, a cross was set on fire in Sawyer, creating a mess of ash that Peter, then working as the city street sweeper, had to clean up the following morning. The Klan's first official rally came short after and attracted about 2,000 people, which is nearly half of Sturgeon Bay's population at that time. Again, the rumor at the time was that a lot of these people were from Manitowoc. However, in other papers, it is noted that there was a lot of public interest in learning what the Klan was about in the area. That following April, another cross was actually burned on Dunlap Reef, accompanied by explosions that shook buildings across the bay. Still, the Klan presence in Sturgeon Bay was ultimately and luckily a blip in Peter's life, with no direct evidence that I was able to find that the Klan ever targeted or harassed Peter. That being said, I think it's important to note that the newspapers probably wouldn't have documented targeted harassment if it did happen. And this is especially given that the newspapers really tried to minimize Klan activities in the area. But yeah, this brings us to Peter's final years. So in 1928, Peter retired from city work, giving up his property in exchange for a pension and funeral care. Later, Peter gave a lecture at the Westside High School about his time in slavery, and one account actually said that students were so engaged and so interested that they asked questions through 2 class periods. Um, that being said, I think, and I suspect this is a part of the reason why Peter retired, is throughout that time he was struggling with illness pretty consistently, including a bout of the Spanish flu that he luckily actually recovered from when he was in his upper 80s. In 1932, however, the flu hit Peter again, and he died at age 90. After his death, Peter was buried at the Bayside Cemetery in an unmarked grave, with the city going back on their earlier promise to pay for his burial expenses. That being said, later the Sturgeon Bay community and the Door County Historical Society actually added a headstone to Peter's grave, which you can see on the top left there. Um, again, in remembrance of Peter, because and I suspect the Green family had a hand to play in it. Overall, Peter was remembered fondly by all that knew him as a very humble man who was respected by everyone and a friend of everyone. I think Peter's life is fascinating for the fact that at the time, I mean, given the time, uh, he experienced remarkably little in terms of targeted racism in Sturgeon Bay. To put this in context, down the Fox Valley, down to Appleton even, there was significant black population that had settled there between the end of the Civil War and the early 1900s. And most of them actually by the 1920s were pushed out due to a combination of harassment, such as the Klan, and racial covenants that were created to prevent black people from being able to own property. Um, Certainly, as is evidenced by the Klan presence, these attitudes were there in Sturgeon Bay. Um, and shockingly, Peter continued to live in the area until he died in 1932, even giving speeches in local schools in the late 1920s. I think really Peter stayed because he saw himself as a true part of the Sturgeon Bay community. And, he was able to create a true home for himself in Sturgeon Bay, again, just becoming another guy in the community who married the sheriff's daughter, was an active member of his church, and gained considerable respect through his work. I think Peter Custis is a remarkable and interesting little bit in Sturgeon Bay's history, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed his story. Again, this is an extremely streamlined version of his story. You can find more. I've got an entire binder of stuff related to Peter Custis back at the museum, so feel free to visit and ask me about it. Um, but yeah, this is the story of Peter Custis. Thank you for listening.